All right. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Faithful Friday. So today we're going to talk about the journey through highs and lows. Have you ever had the opportunity to hike like a mountain and then, within a short period of time, maybe come over that mountain and find yourself coming down the other side and coming down into what might feel like a valley, and you get to experience that high and low, the high of the mountaintop and the valley, right, of being between the mountains or on the other side of the mountain. As I'm sharing this, I'm reminded of, I used to live in California, Northern California, just outside of Sacramento, and I actually remember these like incredible opportunities where it was able to go east to like the Sierra Nevada mountains up into Lake Tahoe and the beautiful areas and the mountains around there, and like hike, or if the wintertime ski, and then like within the same day or the next day get back in the car and go all the way back into the valley of where Sacramento is, right? Or sometimes even continue and go west to San Francisco, where you'd end up being right at the ocean, and the contrast, right? The contrast of landscape, of elevation. I remember that being such kind of a crazy experience, right? Going from these highs and these lows. When we think about not just topography and landscape, but just think about those ideas of highs and lows in like our emotional experience. Like I remember as a kid, having the opportunity to go to camp in the summer, and I would have this mountaintop high, this experience of camp was incredible. It was amazing, especially some of those Christian camps where there's a spiritual high, right? But then camp is over and you have to say goodbye to everybody, and you're crying and it's sad, and you got to get back in the car or back on the bus or whatever it is, and you got to go home, and then you get back to your home, and for whatever reason, home just doesn't seem nearly as exciting or fun or adventurous, right? And you kind of feel that kind of after camp kind of lull, or it's just this kind of drain, right? And you kind of feel ugh, I've come off this mountaintop experience, and now I'm kind of feeling that valley experience. I think if we had time, I could tell you more stories, or if you were here with me, you could probably share some of your own stories about having those highs and lows, those mountaintops and those valley experiences. So today I want to talk about that with a story from the Bible, and how this character experienced it, and how that kind of connects with our experience, and in the midst of it, how we connect with God. So I want to tell you the story of Elijah. So this is the Old Testament. This is in the book of 1 Kings. Elijah was a prophet, and he has exactly this kind of highs and lows experience. So let me just set it up. I'm not going to, just for sake of time, I'm not going to read all of the verses for you, but I'm going to summarize the story for you. So it starts out in 1 Kings chapter 18, I think it's verses 20 it starts with, and through verse 39. And here's what's happening. So again, Elijah, he's a prophet of Israel. He's at Mount Carmel, and there are the prophets of Baal. So he finds himself in kind of a situation where he's at odds with, and essentially trying to evangelize to these prophets of Baal. He's up in a mountain, Mount Carmel, and Elijah challenges the prophets to this crazy challenge, which is this. He tells the prophets of Baal, "Hey, you're going to make an altar. I'm going to make an altar. You're going to put the calf on it and the wood around it, and you're going to do all that stuff, right? I'm going to do the same." Right. And then he says to the prophets of Baal, "Hey, I'm gonna challenge you to be able to call upon your God." Baal is their god. All right, and ask him to bring fire from heaven to inflame the altar. Okay, so it was super common back in that day for the Israelites sacrificing to God and to other religions. In this case, the god of Baal and these prophets of Baal, right? That preparing an altar and making a sacrifice again was a very, common tradition and a part of their spiritual experience, right? So within that context, here's what Elijah does that. Like, hey, I want you to make an altar. I want you to cry out to your God, and we're going to see, if he shows up, right? If he's going to respond and he's going to send down fire from heaven, right? And then Elijah says, and when you're done, I'm going to do the same thing. And essentially, the challenge is whichever God responds, whichever God brings fire from heaven, that's the God we're going to go with. That's how we're going to kind of resolve this disagreement we have. This is how we're going to determine, hey, who has the real God? So the prophets of Baal, they do all their work. They prepare their altar. They put the sacrifice, the cattle on the wood all around it. And they start chanting, and they start singing, and they start praying, and they do whatever it is they got to do, right, to kind of go through their rituals to be able to get Baal's attention. So it's like time is going on, and nothing's happening, and the daylight sun is like beating, and it's hot, and people are getting tired, and here's Elijah. He's getting kind of bored, or he gets to the point where he actually starts taunting them, right? He says, like, to the degree of, like, maybe Baal is sleeping, maybe he's not paying attention, maybe you got to yell louder, maybe you should dance faster. So the prophets of Baal, they actually take drastic measures, right, to be able to get the attention of Baal. But at the end of this part of the story, nothing happens, right? There's no fire from heaven. There's no parting, of the skies. Nothing happens. So at some point, after the prophets of Baal are exhausted and discouraged, it's now Elijah's turn. And Elijah, again, prepares his altar. He puts the calf on the altar, the wood all around. But then he actually does something interesting, something different than the prophets of Baal. He says, hey, I want you to take buckets of water. I want you to go to the well, get buckets of water, and I want you to pour it, like submerge, like put a moat around it, like drown it, whatever you got to do with water. Right, so we know that obviously it's hard for a fire to start if it's wet, and not just wet, but soaked, right? So Elijah's so confident, right? I mean, there's even like a little bit of kind of arrogance, or a lot bit of arrogance with Elijah. Right? He's so confident in God that God's gonna show up and God's gonna show off. And so the prophets of Baal, they do all this, right? And then Elijah prays a prayer, a simple prayer of like, God, please, please show up. Please show everyone that you are the real God. And in an instant, there is this fire from heaven that shoots down to the ground, and not just anywhere, but it shoots directly and specifically on the altar, right? The one that is soaked and drenched, right? And nothing would light. But guess what? It does. The whole thing goes up in flames, right? And in that moment, there's this incredible miracle that happens, and there's this amazing sense of awe that occurs, right? After Elijah prays to God, God sends fire. And the response of the people is they declare, like, the Lord, He is God, right? So they see it for themselves. Okay, so this part of the story, Elijah experiences this incredible spiritual victory, like this, really high spiritual moment, right? Like, God shows up, He does a miracle, all the people see it, they declare that Elijah's God is God, like this amazing moment. Okay, so before I go on with the story, I just want you to maybe just pause for a second, just think about a time in your life when you've had like that mountaintop experience where you've clearly seen God show up, like you've clearly seen His power at work. I mean, I can think of several times in my own life where God has shown up, where I've been able to see His power at work. So I think it's helpful for us just to recognize in the midst of this, like, mountaintop experiences build our faith, right? When we can have those spiritual heightened experiences, it builds our faith. They remind us of God's power, of God's presence. But we also have to remember this. that those mountaintop experiences are not permanent, right? They're not sustained or even sustainable. They're not permanent. And the recognition that the challenges will still come, like life still happens, right? And the top, like for every mountain has a way up and every mountain has a way down, right? That's the way God created and designed mountains. And it's that way in our experience, in our emotions, in our everyday life. Okay, so let's continue on with this story. Okay, so as soon as that happens, right, there's this like amazing mountaintop experience. Okay, then we move on into 1 Kings. We're going to move to chapter 19 now. And again, I'll just paraphrase for you. But this is chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. So after the victory, there's the queen of the land. Her name is Queen Jezebel. And she threatens Elijah's life. Like she's like basically like, hey, kill that guy. Like that guy exposed like our religion and our God. And this guy came in and like threatened the very like spiritual foundation and basis for which we exist, right? And so Queen Jezebel was not as much impressed as she was threatened. Like, who is this guy and who is this God? We want nothing to do with him. And she ordered, like, get rid of him. So as soon as this incredible mountaintop experience happens, right, there's this immediate threat. And Elijah goes from like joy, he goes from like excitement and enthusiasm and this incredible experience, like emotionally, to instantly to a different experience. And it's the experience of fear, right? This like fight or flight mode that kicks in, right? Like Queen Jezebel says, like, get rid of that guy. We can't have him around, right? He's threatening our way of life and he's challenging our religion. So Elijah, he's this other kind of emotion. He's overwhelmed, right? He's overwhelmed by fear, and he runs into the wilderness. So he runs into the wilderness, and like just running as fast as he can, right? He's being chased as he does that, right? He has to get away from the soldiers. He has to get away from the people to basically fend for his life. So he finds himself in the wilderness, and as that happens, he's exhausted, he's overwhelmed, he's afraid. And he makes this statement to God. He says, God, I have had enough. And then he says, Lord, take my life. Did you catch that? Like, God, I've had enough. Lord, take my life. Like, this is actually one of the few times in scriptures we actually see someone who says, like, I don't want to live anymore. Like, God, I'm overwhelmed. I'm afraid. Right? Like, just take me away. And so, like, are you catching this? Like, this shift that we see in the emotional experience with Elijah, right? He's, like, going from, there's a miracle that's happened, and he's excited, and he's, like, awe-struck by God's power, and he's like excited, right, that the people have responded to like your God. He is like your Lord. He is God, is what they said, right? To all of a sudden, he's afraid, he's overwhelmed, he's running, and he gets to this place of just like not just physical exhaustion, but emotional exhaustion, where he's like, God, I've had enough, right? Like, Lord, just like take me away. I think we just have to acknowledge, like, here's Elijah, right? Like a mighty prophet of God who feels discouraged. He feels alone. Now I want you to take a moment. I want you to think about that. Like this kind of reflection questions for yourself. Like, when have you felt like Elijah? Exhausted, discouraged, questioning purpose? Like, what was going on in your life? What was the context, the situation? What led you to that place? Like, as I think about those questions, I've had some of those moments in my life where I've just felt like, God, like, this can't be happening. Like, I'm overwhelmed, right? I'm exhausted. I'm discouraged. I'm afraid. I don't know what you're up to. I don't know why I find myself here. And I don't want to be here, right? Like, I don't want to experience the discomfort and the pain and the struggle of this valley experience in life. So here's a couple applications I think that are helpful for us. One is, even strong believers experience deep disappointment. Oh, I think that's so important for us to hear. Even strong believers experience deep disappointment. Have you all seen the bumper sticker or the social media meme that, or the T-shirts? They all say faith over fear. I get what that's trying to communicate to us, right? That we should hold on to and grab on to faith, right? God will overcome, right? Absolutely. That's the posture we want to have. But I think it actually discredits something that's very real, which is just simply this idea that faith and fear, they kind of coexist. In fact, they kind of have to coexist, right? In order for us to lean into that faith that God is going to show up and do all that he's going to do, right? It often comes from a place of desperation, from fear, from anxiety. That's what's going on with Elijah. And I know in my own life, I've had those moments too. Okay, so even strong believers experience disappointment. Back to this idea of even in our best moments and even of our highest heights, right, we can still experience disappointment. Okay, this next one, spiritual highs can be followed by emotional lows. That's the story here of Elijah, right? I've had that experience myself. Maybe you have too. And then this other important takeaway, which is when we feel weak, God doesn't abandon us. Like in our weakness, right? God's not going to leave us or forsake us. We know the verse that says, when you're weak, he is strong. Right? We know that passage that I just paraphrased, right? This idea of, I will never leave you nor forsake you, says the Lord. Okay, so I want to just go on before we wrap up to talk about these last few verses of the story, which I think are really important. So let's go back into the story of Elijah. Remember, he's at Mount Carmel. They do the altars. He's there with the prophets of Baal, right? The prophets of Baal produce nothing. Elijah prays to God. God sends down fire. It lights up. The people are amazed. They declare that Elijah's Lord is God. Elijah has this incredible mountaintop spiritual high, immediately followed by Queen Jezebel, who is threatened by Elijah's God. And she says, get rid of him. Right? And so Elijah goes from that experience quickly into this fight or flight, and he's afraid, and he's literally on the run for his life. And he runs into the wilderness, right? He has that experience that we just talked about in the few verses leading up to this, God, I've had enough. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I'm discouraged. I don't know what you're up to, and I don't really want anything to do with it. Take me away. But then it goes on in these verses. And here's what happens next. So instead of rebuking Elijah, God provides for Elijah. If you read through those verses, it actually said an angel of the Lord touched him. That's pretty cool. An angel of the Lord touched him. And when that happened, it said get up and eat and drink. And instantly in that moment, another miracle happens. Elijah finds what they describe in Scripture as this, some kind of bread or cake. He finds purified water. Remember, Elijah's in the wilderness. He ran away from everyone, right? There's no one around. And God provides this miracle of hey, I want you to get up and I want you to eat and drink. And we don't know exactly how it happened other than it happened by God. But he gets up and he finds bread or cake, and he finds clean water, right? God doesn't rebuke him. God attends to him and provides for him. So Elijah attends to, he responds, he cares, attends to himself, right? Self-care, right? So he eats and he drinks. And then there's this amazing part where God wants to He chooses to speak to Elijah. And God and Elijah have this interaction. And God ultimately reveals himself not with like this wind that blows by, right? And we read that in the story, or this earthquake that shakes the ground, or this fire that like bursts out. After all of that, this like interaction that Elijah has with God, this like loud, powerful expression of God's presence, God does actually something incredibly unexpected. After all of that's happened, right? Elijah's probably a little bit like overwhelmed and like traumatized, right? There's this quiet whisper. And God gently and quietly whispers to Elijah. And in that moment, God speaks to him. And again, this is kind of a paraphrase, but in this moment where Elijah feels all alone, like he had to run for his life, he ran into the wilderness, he's all by himself, God reminds him that there are 7,000 faithful followers that still remain. Now, why is that significant? Because it's the reminder of hope. It's the reminder that God's still at work, that there's still purpose, that there's a future to step into. There's mission to move forward in. And so in that moment, in that quiet whisper, God renews a sense of life and meaning and purpose in Elijah's spirit. And he sends him back out on his mission. Isn't that amazing? All right, so I want you to just think with me, reflect with me for a moment. How has God met you in your low moments? Like, what gentle whispers has he used to remind you of his goodness and his faithfulness? All right, we talked earlier about we were able to kind of identify some of those moments of the low valleys. Okay, so this follow-up of, right, how has God met you in those moments? How did he show up? What gentle whispers has he used to remind you of his goodness and his faithfulness? Okay, a few applications of this part of the story. First of all, God doesn't abandon us in the valley. Like in those dark, quiet, lonely, exhausted moments, God is still present. We also see from the story is, where God didn't rebuke Elijah, but rather he provided for Elijah. Like he actually attended to him. So this idea that God meets our needs, like our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. He hears us, he sees us, and he responds to us. And then this last application is his plan for us isn't over just because we're discouraged. That's one of the things I love about this story with Elijah and how God shows up, not just to give him food and water and said, hey, get back up and get back out there, but he speaks to him in that quiet whisper. It reminds him that there's still mission, there's still purpose. And he helps motivate him and remind him to get back to the mission, right, with love and grace. I know that God does that in my life, and I want you to be attentive to how God might do that in your life, right? Just because we're discouraged doesn't mean it's over, right? That there's an opportunity to see a bigger context, a greater perspective around purpose and meaning and mission for our life. All right, so I just want to wrap up with a couple takeaways before we're done today. The first is this. We saw in this story, God's with us in those mountaintop moments, and he's with us in those valley moments. Second is this. Every spiritual leader struggles, but God sustains us. So whether you are spiritually uh, leading in the community or in a church, you're spiritual leading in your family, you're even just spiritual leading yourself. This idea of like every spiritual leaders struggle, like we all struggle, but God sustains us. And then this idea of God's gentle whispers speak hope, reminding us of his ongoing plan. God's gentle whispers speak hope, reminding us of his ongoing plan. I think there's a couple important things about that. This idea of God's gentle whispers, I think it's really important for us. Because I remember hearing a message one time about like our opportunity and our responsibility to like tone down the volume of everything around us so we can actually hear the whisper. So we can actually be intentional and attentive to moments that God would speak to us in quiet whispers. And when he does, again, this idea of hope, reminding us of his ongoing, I think that's another key word, ongoing. Like God's plan was from like day one when, there is no day one with God, right? I mean, he's always been and he'll always be. But even from day one of creation, there's been a plan from the very beginning. And that plan is ongoing. And whatever valley we're in right now, whatever mountaintop we've experienced, it's all a part of a greater plan. All right, I hope that this was encouraging to you. Whether you find yourselves in a mountaintop, in a valley, or somewhere in between, again, just hold on to this truth, right, that God is with us every step of the way, all the time. So again, you can go back and read this story. I encourage you to do that. This is in 1 Kings chapters 18 and chapters 19. All right, it's great to be with you guys today. Just want to encourage you to continue to tune in with us every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Mondays we do Mindset Monday. Wednesdays we do Wellness Wednesdays. And of course, here on Fridays we do Faithful